So I was going to name this sermon, Not Your Grandmother's Jesus, because often we domesticate Jesus, I think. Like the idea of taking a wild animal and putting it into a cage. I think often what we do is we grandmify, is that a word? Jesus, or grandpafy Jesus, right? In a way where we don't understand Jesus and the things that he actually taught. And so often we treat him, I think, like Mr. Rogers. And if you love Mr. Rogers, I love Mr. Rogers. I think he is a phenomenal person. But he's the image of, I think, what a lot of people think Jesus is. Just this nice man from the neighborhood who loved kids and was super gentle and kind. And yes, Jesus was gentle, Jesus was kind. But he brought the truth in a way where many people left offended. And this is the reason that Jesus was crucified. Because people actually hated what Jesus said and taught. And it is a passage like this for many of you, if you are new to the faith, if you were brought here from to this space because someone else wanted to invite you to church. This is the message where that person who invited you to church is wondering, oh, did I bring my friend at a wrong week? Because it's filled, right, with this idea of fire and judgment and division, and Jesus makes no apology. And so what we want to do is actually really look into what did Jesus say, what did it mean, and then he actually invites you be the judge of what Jesus said. And that's the hope. And the first thing that we see that Jesus teaches is the great cost of following Jesus. The great cost of following Jesus. Tell your neighbor there's a great cost. There's a great cost. I know you haven't done that in a while. There's a great cost in following Jesus. And Jesus makes no apology. Verse 49. I came to cast fire on earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with. How great is my distress until it is accomplished. It's a message about judgment. And if someone who has not been exposed to church came here today, they would be tempted to walk out these doors because they don't want a religion of judgment. So it's hard to read. And you wonder why there are passages like this, and you wonder why Jesus taught passages like this. And it gets worse. It gets worse. Verse 51, do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And he gives these examples. From now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. The idea of the very people that you love, you're divided from. And when you read the passage, the portion where it talks about mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, I know for some of you are thinking, Jesus, I don't need help with division there because you already have that division. But the whole idea is, even if you do have a great relationship with your mother-in-law, that Jesus came here to divide. And he doesn't mince words here. He's very, very, very clear. And so, you have to ask, why would Jesus come to cause division? Did he mean something else? Because you don't hear a message like this in the church regularly. Did he mean something else? What is his goal? Did he come here to actually bring pain upon the earth? Was that his goal? And then you think about, for many of you, Christmas is coming, right? And what's Jesus known as during Christmas, right? The man of peace, the prince of peace. So now you have to really do some exegetical, some Bible work. If Jesus talks about being the man of peace, being the prince of peace, he brings peace, then what is this that Jesus is saying about him coming here to bring division, right? There's many passages that Jesus talks about in Luke 1:79, talking about Jesus, that he will guide our feet into the way of peace, right? Luke 2:14, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace. This is a Christmas passage, right? Peace among those with whom he is pleased. Even John 14, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as this world gives, but do I give to you. Talking about how his peace is different than the peace that you experience here on earth. It's very clear that Jesus is a man of peace. He is the Prince of Peace. But Jesus is also very explicit in saying that not only did he come here to bring peace, he came here to bring judgment. And you have to be able to not just gloss over these passages, you have to be able to understand why Jesus says such things. And then when you do, what you will find is a glorious gospel, a glorious Jesus. And I want us to then stay here for a moment. Because the very thing that brings peace is the very thing that brings judgment. The very thing that brings peace is the very thing that brings judgment. It's two sides of the same coin. So as he brings peace, judgment is there as well. And for us, I think it's hard to receive, especially for us who live in a world where tolerance and being inclusive is the key words of our culture, right? It's all about being tolerant of different people's views, tolerant of other people's views on gender, about marriage, about religion, right? So you want to be inclusive. And Jesus was okay being exclusive. And it's hard to hear. And what is this thing that brings peace? What is this thing that brings judgment? It's truth. Truth, by definition, is exclusive. Truth, by definition, is a truth claim by default is exclusive. 2 plus 2 is 4. It is not 5. It's a truth claim. So with this truth statement, there's other things that don't fall in line. And it's the same thing that Jesus is not going to be talking about. As he brings division, he then shows you why he brings division. And you have to be able to see this to be able to actually appreciate what Jesus is doing. And so he goes on. In verse 54, he says to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once, a shower is coming. And so it happens. And when you see the sound, and when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? In that land, as there was a wind, as there was a cloud that would form, they knew from which sea it would come and the type of weather that would follow. And Jesus is saying, if you can be so observant to be able to notice that, what he is saying is, why can't you tell what's happening before your eyes is unique and different? And the challenge is then, in verse 57, why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? What he is saying is very unique, where what he is saying is he's saying you can judge all that happens around, but what happens right before your eyes, you have to be able to acknowledge that it's different. So now it's an open invitation. What Jesus welcomes is for you to be able to thoroughly investigate what Jesus said and what he did. And this is an open invitation. And this is different than maybe how you grew up in church. If you had a doubt, maybe your youth pastor said, oh, you shouldn't doubt. That's not right. That's wrong. Where is your faith? And just told you to, conjure up more faith and believe. But Jesus doesn't do that. What Jesus does is very, very clear. He says, you have to see what I'm about, and then he then gives you the invitation. You be the judge of what is right, which means that you have the capacity. Jesus gave you the faculties. to be able to interpret if what Jesus did was true and what he said is right. And this is different than politicians, right? We just went through a huge wave in the U.S. at least of politicians. And there's all this bickering back and forth, right? And what's the hard thing about a politician? You don't know if he's telling the truth, right? Every 4 years, they change their opinion. And so you don't know what to believe. And it's in that extreme when you realize when a man is not clear with his words, he doesn't mean what he says and doesn't say what he means, it's in that position you start to realize what Jesus is saying is true. It was true when he said it, then it's true when he says it now. And he's not a politician. He's got nothing to hide. He's an open book. All the things that he does is done before the public, which is also different than other religions. Many religions, there's the leader who has a private vision, and it's in that private vision that they experience or have a vision of God, and then they bring it to the public, never disclosing what really happened. And with Jesus, again, it's all public. In the baptism, it was public. People heard audibly from the Father, "This is my Son, whom I love, whom I'm well pleased with." The transfiguration, right? There was Peter and John right next to him. They see something happening to Jesus, right? Even the crucifixion, even the resurrection, what happens? He shows himself before many people. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about how he shows himself before 500 people. This is why Christianity has become a movement, because they have taken the claims of Jesus and they have decided whether his claims were true. And that's what he is saying. He is saying the world will have a judgment on who Jesus is. And so he invites you, saying, don't take the faith because of what your parents believed. Don't believe the faith because of what your friends say. Don't listen to what pop culture says. The invitation is what? You. You be the judge of who Jesus is. And if you are the judge of who Jesus is, and you look long and hard at passages like this, what you will find is that he is who he claimed to be, and that is why people are willing to live and die. They count the cost. They're willing to be separated from family because they believe he is Jesus. You see, it's not that Jesus has not been investigated and then therefore rejected. It's that Jesus has been misunderstood and therefore unknown. That's the world, right? It's not that they've actually investigated and therefore rejected. They've misunderstood and therefore he's left unknown. And so for you here, the reason you're here is you have made those investigations. And in that you have chosen to believe that he is God to the point where this gospel does cost you. For some of you, the hardest thing is that your mother, right, your father, a close friend does not believe. And that's the hardest thing, is it not? But you continue to follow Jesus. Why? Even though there's a great cost, you have investigated him and you found him to be true. And the thing is, well, if you think that once you make that decision, then you don't have to make that decision again. But other things will happen in your life where all your emotions and all the things that happen in your life will tell you that God's not real or he is not good. And again, that claim still stands. He invites you and asks you to judge. And so that's why it's costly. There's a gospel that is costly. And the invitation is that you can know with certainty who he is and therefore believe. But he doesn't end there. He continues on with harder truth. That not only is there a cost of following Jesus and the gospel, there's a greater cost of not following Jesus. As great of a cost that there is to be able to follow Christ, Jesus then says, yes, it is hard to follow me. But what he also then says is that it's even harder if you don't follow me. In verse 57, it says, "Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? As you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison." This is a clear picture of what Jesus is doing. He's saying that there's an ultimate judge, the Father, and he will come to judge. And right now, what he is saying is, I am here, the accuser. And so what he has just done is he has accused humanity of what they have done. This is not an easy thing to hear. And so there's the Father who is the judge, and there's Jesus who is the accuser, and he is pleading with his people, listen to me. Settle the account before that day on judgment. What Luke reminds his disciples of is, one, the cost of their decision, but what he also does is show them the cost of their indecision, the cost of what happens when you don't choose. And if you've ever gone to court, you recognize the little power that you have. Any of you been to court before? You don't have to raise your hand. But I've been to court before, and you're probably wondering, what did the pastor go to court for? It wasn't anything major, but it was big enough where I wanted to fight for my rights. What had happened is it was shortly into my seminary years. I was in St. Louis, and a friend of mine had passed away. And I was a youth pastor at the time, and so I wanted to go to the funeral. And I had to leave St. Louis at around 11 p.m. to be able to go up to the funeral for the next day. And from St. Louis to Chicago is about 5 hours. And so I leave around 10 or 11 with my wife, with my daughter, pack up the car, we leave. And, it's a 5-hour drive, so it's long, tired. Around 1 a.m., 2 a.m., I'm driving, and all of a sudden, you see the blue and red lights behind you. In Korea, when you see that, it's like, whatever. But in the U.S., it's quite alarming because, you realize how much power the police has. And so I pull over, my heart's beating, and the police officer comes and he says, "Do you know you're speeding?" And I was like, "Oh, there's no way I was speeding," right? So I tell him, respectfully, I don't think I was speeding, officer. Speed limits, I think 55 or 65, and I was maybe going like 5 over. And so I don't think I was speeding. He's like, "Oh, no, you were speeding. Did you know this is a construction zone?" I was like, "Oh, didn't know that." And so I try to tell him, I'm going to Chicago this weekend, going to my friend's funeral. I'm super tired coming from work. Please, give me a break, right? He says, "No, writes up a ticket." Right. So I, go to my friend's funeral, come back to St. Louis, and I think about it's a $300 ticket, right? It ain't cheap, right? And so I wonder, what should I do? I don't want to pay this ticket. I didn't notice that it was construction, and so I decided to call my police friends, call my attorney friends, and try to create a case to be able to go before the judge. Talk to all of them, get everything, set. I think of a decent case before the judge. I go to the court on the court date. They call my name, and I have no idea how this works, right? I go up there. He asks something. I say something, and I try to make my case, thinking, okay, maybe he will listen. And then he simply asks, "Were you speeding?" I was like, "Well, I was going this speed." He's like, "What was the speed limit?" I tell him, "Well, in the construction zone, it was, this speed." And he's like, "Guilty." And I was like, but, and I try to make my case, but then you realize I could have all the reasons in your mind, but before the judge who has all authority, his judgment in that situation is final. And this is what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying is on that day, God is holy. He will judge rightly, just as we expect the judge to be able to judge rightly. upon any crime. What we want is justice. We don't want mercy at the time. We want justice, especially for the more evil things that we see. That's what we want, right? And on that day, because God is holy, he will judge. And so what Jesus is saying is that cost is so much greater. And because that cost is so much greater, he is now come to bring and reconcile. And that's the whole point of this passage. That on that day, you can sweet talk your way out of most things, but on that day, you won't be able to sweet talk your way before him. Because he is just and he is holy. And if you think about it, we want God to be just and holy. When you think about the great evils of the world, what you want is justice for those people. And then you start to realize this is the God that you do want. But it's hard to accept, isn't it? The cost of following Jesus is great. That's what Jesus is saying. If you follow me, there's a great, great cost. You will be persecuted potentially. Friends and family may look at you differently. There'll be now division because of me. That's what he's saying. And if that's not hard enough, on that day, there's even a greater cost. So he gives these very clear and honest judgments. But what you have to be able to walk away with today is the greatest cost is not on us. The greatest cost is Jesus' cost. Right, that's the great cost. The greatest cost is Christ's. Because what he then points out through all of this is he talks about how every penny would have to be paid because God is just and holy. But what he also then says in verse 58, he says, to make every effort to settle with your accuser. And what's so amazing about this passage is not that God has come down to make settlement with us. What's so unbelievably profound here in this passage is that how he does it. In verse 49, he says, I came to cast fire on earth, and would that it were already kindled. So you're thinking, Jesus, you want the wrath of God to come down that badly? But then he says in verse 50, I have a baptism to be baptized with. How great is my distress until it is accomplished. This idea of casting fire is what happens when you put anything that is impure into fire. What naturally happens is all the impurities waste away and what's pure remains. That's the idea. Jesus is a man of peace. He is the gospel. He has come to present the gospel. And so the whole idea is if you accept him, you become purified. If you reject him, then there is judgment. And so he is then with the people making a case. And then in verse 50, he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with. How great is my distress until it is accomplished. What's so surprising is that Jesus is distressed. That word distressed, the idea of it is he's doing everything possible to keep himself together. It's the idea as soon as he knew what his mission was, he knew what he would have to do on that day to actually present himself. He knew that he would have to be baptized. The whole idea of baptism is you are submerged underwater. That's the idea. It's the idea of this baptism that Jesus will be baptized with. And that baptism is suffering. That baptism is wrath. And what Jesus is saying here is that he is going to go through this to save. That's what he's saying. He's saying he's going to go through this, that he is eager to be able to go through this. He wishes it was already kindled, but he can't actually purify yet. He can't actually save yet because he himself has to be baptized. Jesus saves through his suffering. It's a saving and the suffering that goes hand in hand. You see, the gospel, it's not a sentimental story. It is the real story of God who loves and suffers even to the point of death to save sinners. But if you think about this is the truth that you need when everything else seems to fall apart. When family members are diagnosed with a disease or cancer, right? When that job that you are at, there's tension. You don't know if you'll be there next year. It's this understanding of knowing how deeply Christ loves you, right? The real story is of God who loves and suffers for you to the point of death. The gospel is costly. It's costly for Christ. It's free for us. Because it's free for us, we don't abuse it, but we know how much Christ paid. And so therefore, for us, it is precious. If you all remember in Narnia, there's the portion when Susan and her siblings finally come into that place where they get to meet Aslan. Many of you know how it goes. Susan's scared. Susan wants to meet Aslan, this lion king, but is worried. So he asks Mr. Beaver, and is he safe? If you know the response, this is what Mr. Beaver says. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. You see, that whole idea of Jesus, when you read these words, it is hard to swallow. There's a great cost in following Christ. There's a great cost in denying Christ. But once you understand the great cost Christ paid so that he would have you, you realize this is why people follow Christ. It's a hard and narrow road. But you recognize when God would sacrifice that much to give his life for us, you recognize no matter what happens in our lives, it's going to be okay. Let's pray.